Good evening. This is R.C. Dozier, and I just wanted to jump on here and just give a brief analysis of a video discussion I was able to tune into. So Dr. Khalil Andani and Dr. Stephen Nemes, they had a discussion about Christian Wagner's views on the Thomistic conception of the Trinity as it's related to divine simplicity. And I thought that I would also discuss the comments that Dr. Stephen Nemes he made against the Thomistic conception of divine simplicity and as it relates to the Trinity. I thought Dr. Nemesh's critique was similar to what my own sympathies as well. As a Trinitarian, I don't see how Thomas's conception of the Trinity is robust enough to give us what we see in the New Testament scriptures of personhood. So Dr. Nemes, he makes the point that, for Thomas, in the first book of the Summa Theologica, Pars 1, some of the questions that Thomas makes, like his discussions, he defines the persons of the divine Trinity as subsisting relations. And this is well known that for Thomas, he's trying his best to articulate a position that is going to ground his understanding. He's trying to preserve God's ultimacy, God's aseity, and he's also trying to preserve a robust conception of monotheism, but also provide room for the doctrine of the Trinity. And his conception is quite brilliant. So he uses this conception of relation where a relation is conceived. So you can look at, I think his last name is John, or his first name is John Hale, I think his name is. He wrote a book recently. It's one of the Cambridge Elements books on relations. And it's quite helpful in terms of metaphysically defining what a relation is in the contemporary literature. But a relation is understood as a modification of an essence or a substance. And, I can't help but think when years past I studied Spinoza, he uses in his ethics some axioms that classical theists would affirm to argue for some sort of pantheism. And one of the core doctrines that Spinoza affirms is divine simplicity, right? Divine. I use that in air quotes, divine. So he says that God is simple, right? God is simple for Spinoza, right? And from that, he deduces that all of reality are modes of God, right? And so this modal language is used by Spinoza, by Leibniz, and a mode is taken as that is indivisible and it is simple, right? But it is numerically identical to the substance. So it's very similar to in my view, it's an improper part, right? It's numerically identical to the substance. And one of the common examples is, you take a fist, a hand, and then a clenched hand is a fist, right? A fist is an improper part of a hand. They're numerically identical, but there's a distinction there, right? And this is helpful, but it seems there is an incommunicable property about them where they're not numerically identical. There is something about it that is distinct such that they are not numerically identical precisely because there is a part that is unique to the in this case the persons, right? So if we're thinking of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit have incommunicable, there's something incommunicable about them to render them distinct, right? And this is understood in terms of the divine processions. And I don't think that the divine processions, if they're understood in terms of causation, right, eternal causation, that the Father eternally causes the Son, if we understand it in that way, then it seems the metaphysics that's undergirding these relations is much more robust than the Thomist admits, right? And you can even bring in Aristotelian language, right? You can say that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they have a general essence, and then each person has an individual essence. And the individual essence, right, is that the Father is the cause, right? The Father's individual essence is the cause of the Son's individual essence, and the Father and the Son, if you affirm the filioque, is the eternal cause of the Holy Spirit's individual essence, right? And in this conception, even with the Aristotelian distinctions, the metaphysics that's underlying Thomas's understanding of the Trinity, it seems like it's inadequate. If you're trying to affirm divine simplicity, it's going to lapse into some sort of modalism where the distinctions are merely conceptual, that there is no extramental distinction within God. And if there is, what exactly within the Trinity is what is it that grounds the intrinsic distinctions within God, right? Because divine simplicity is saying that there is no intrinsic distinctions within God because God's essence is indivisible, right? And God's essence is simple. And so what is it about the divine essence that grounds these intrinsic distinctions, right? Unless you want to say that there are no intrinsic distinctions within God. God is an undifferentiated substance, in which case there really isn't any foundation for the Trinity, right? So going back to Thomas. So Thomas thinks that the divine processions, that the three persons are modes of God, right? And these modes are simple. And so Thomas thinks that he can affirm both divine simplicity and the doctrine of the Trinity. And Dr. Nemes, he makes the point that there isn't really any way to consistently hold to both of these doctrines, to affirm divine simplicity and to affirm the Holy Trinity. They're mutually exclusive. And he takes aim at Thomas, and they talk about the processions that internal to the processions, that is to say that this idea of producer and product, there is a clear distinction that has metaphysical weight such that it undermines divine simplicity, right? And I think that if I understand Dr. Nemes accurately, that's valid. But just thinking about relations themselves, it seems that relations would entail properties, right? So really the question is, well, how do we define simplicity? And they're just going to say, well, it means that God has no parts, right? Or components. But then the question would be, well, what is a part, right? What is a component? And here's where I think that when you look at Thomas and you compare it with John Duns Scotus, you see that clearly a distinction, but I think what's the core claim for Thomas is this idea that they're numerically identical, right? And this is why Thomists typically require some type of relative identity, right? And you can look at, I think, Chris Tweed. He has a paper where he tries to argue for divine simplicity, and well, his view of the Trinity model with divine simplicity. But I still don't see, given Thomism and this idea of a modification of the substance, that there are three modes, that the three persons are understood as modes. Well, modes, are they understood as improper parts? And if so, I have to wonder why are they treated as simple, right? Because there is incommunicable attributes about the divine persons that render them distinct, right? And the Thomist claim is, well, that's from the divine processions. That's the only essential defining feature that distinguishes the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are these subsisting relations, the processions. But the processions in and of themselves, it's not adequate to be able to ground personhood, right? And the Thomist conception of personhood is going to be, the three persons are understood as subjects, right? They are whos, right? God is one what that is three whos. And I believe even Thomas says something similar to that in his writings. And it's odd because if God is conceived as one, a simple substance, a single simple substance. So there's one intelligence, one mind, if we want to use contemporary language. And so that one mind, looks back at itself, right? And sometimes, like, for example, Rob Koons, he uses this. He says that, so he uses this psychological analogy that you have the knower, which is the Father, you have the known, which is the Son, and then you have the conjunction of the knower and the known, which is the Holy Spirit, right? But even then, you have three subjects. So what is it within the simple God that grounds these three subjects? Now, you would say, well, that's the processions. Okay, but if there's one substance, what is it that gives rise to the plurality within God? Well, it's the oneness, right? The Father, right? Okay, but the Father gives rise to the Son, and this is eternal, right? And then the Father and the Son, if you affirm the filioque, eternally gives rise to the Holy Spirit. And we can understand this, the processions, in a couple different ways, as Russell Fieldman, in his book on medieval theology, Scotus, his understanding versus Aquinas, right? However we conceive it, whether it be like some type of emanation, it's not really that important at this point. But the key point is that the Father, the one, but see, they are eternally simultaneous, right? There's a priority though, right? And that's going to be this relations of origin where the Father is the fountainhead of divinity, right? This monarchy, the idea of the monarchy of the Father. So even with all that, it seems like you still need a ground for the Trinity, right? And so in some sense, the Trinity is seen as some type of foundationalism, right? And the problem is with some type of metaphysical foundationalism, You have the Father, then you have the Son, then you have the Holy Spirit. Even with this metaphysical foundationalism, you have to, they have to be distinct, and there has to be some sort of metaphysical distinction within God to be able to differentiate them. And the Thomist seems to want to, continue to affirm that the three persons do not collapse into one person, but then at the same time they want to say that all the distinctions within the Trinity are that that three persons are numerically identical to the divine essence, but the three persons are not numerically identical to each other, and yet the three persons are numerically identical to the divine essence. And if you had, the only way I can see this is something like Brian Leftow's view of the Trinity, right? Where you have, if we can imagine a simple being that somehow, well, for Brian Leftow, he thinks he conceives of it as like a human being, right? He uses that as kind of an analogy, but if you can think of it, a simple being that duplicates itself, in that case, you'd have three beings, right? So that would be tritheism. But there is a way to understand how you can have three simple beings, but I don't see how you can have three simple persons that are numerically identical to the same substance or same being. I don't, and that's where we go back to think of Spinoza. Spinoza's view is that everything is God, right? Pantheism seems to be Spinoza's view, but he saw everything within God is God, right? So he had some sort of strong doctrine of divine simplicity, and he thought of everything as modes of God, right? So everything, that there are in fact distinctions, but all the modes are reducible to the divine substance. And in the case of the divine persons, the three divine persons are irreducible. They cannot be reduced to each other, right? They are numerically distinct, it seems. But that's what the Thomists are trying to say is, well, no, the three persons are not numerically distinct from the divine essence, right? They're numerically identical to the divine essence, but they're numerically distinct from each other. And that's why many people say, this seems to either be modalistic, because the three persons seem to collapse into one person, or it seems to be tritheistic, because, if each person has all of what it means to be God, and they are numerically distinct from each other, it seems like, well, then there must be three. There can't be one divine essence. There must be three, right? And divine simplicity is trying to protect, no, they're numerically identical to the same they're numerically identical to the one divine essence. And this is where I don't know how the Thomists can get out of this, because there has to be something extramental in God that grounds these distinctions. And the divine processions in and of themselves does not provide, it's not the sufficient and necessary conditions for personhood is not met, in my view, just from the divine processions themselves, unless you add on additional criteria, right? Or additional sufficient and necessary conditions to allow the processions to, in other words, you have to supplement the divine processions in order to be able to have the necessary and sufficient conditions met for divine personhood. And so I think at the end of the day, modes has to be understood as properties or parts. And that's why I think Scotus sees, we have to use a formal distinction, which is, you can look at Garrett Smith's work, or you can look at Stephen Dumont, or Thomas Williams and others, and Richard Cross, who's written on Scotus's views. But the formal distinction, it's going to say that there is a robust realist type of distinction. This formal distinction is the idea that there is within the object an intrinsic distinction that is extramental, right? And I think that's what Thomists are going to have to say, that within God there is an extramental distinction within God. And then the question will be, well, with divine simplicity, how can you have that? You have to be able to explicate precisely, how can you have an extramental distinction within God if all that is in God is God, and that God has no parts, right? God has no properties, strictly speaking. So then what is it about God that distinguishes intrinsically God, right? And the processions is not sufficient to ground these distinctions, not personal distinctions, right? And I think that and this is my complaint with aspects, right? So you have, I think it's Donald Baxter, Joshua Sijuwati uses Donald Baxter's work to articulate this idea of an aspect, right? Well, an aspect, as citing Baxter's work, aspects seem to be more than just an improper part. They seem to have more metaphysical weight than that. And so in my mind, by my lights, we need to just simply embrace that it's more than that, that there are ways, metaphysical ways, that we can articulate the doctrine of the Trinity without divine simplicity, right? And I'm thinking Matthew Badendorf's paper or Gregory Fowler's paper when it comes to priority or simplicity. I think we're going to have to do something that goes beyond Thomas. Not to say Thomas is brilliant. We should try and salvage what we can from him, but I don't think on this issue it works. I just don't see it. And people can say, I need to read more Thomas, but I just don't see how the Trinity can be made sense of with divine simplicity. Now, what I've heard some Trinitarians say is, well, you know what? And using the one in many problem, right? So the one in the many problem, which is an ancient problem. What some Trinitarians will say is, well, no. God's oneness and God's threeness are co-ultimate, right? And you see this work in James and Anderson. But if they're co-ultimate, I mean, that has to be a paradox, because they cannot be co-ultimate, right? They're either, in metaphysics, you either have monism or pluralism. You can't have both, right? And when we apply that to the Trinity, where ultimately, in terms of what God is, right, we'd have to affirm that there's one divine substance, not many. And then the persons are, depending upon your view of the Trinity, the persons are either constituted or composed, that depending upon your view, either the three persons compose the Trinity or the divine substance constitutes the three persons. Thinking of either Chad McIntosh's work or thinking of William Hasker's work. But those views will allow you to have a robust distinction between the three divine persons that will deny divine simplicity as conceived by Thomas. but it will make sense of the Trinity, right? And I was thinking of a paper I read quite a long time back. So it's a paper by Richard Cross, and the paper is called Latin Trinitarianism, Some Conceptual and Historical Considerations. And Dr. Cross, he basically argues in that paper that Thomas's view seems to say that the three persons are actually, that it is a distinction of reason, that the three persons are distinct by a distinction of reason and not a extramental distinction between the three persons. And, you know, if that's true, then I don't see how modalism can be evaded, right? But, you know, if Thomas is saying, no, the three persons, there is in fact an extramental distinction, well, then what exactly in God is it that distinguishes the three divine persons, right? And, well, the Thomist is going to say, well, it's God that distinguishes the distinctions within God. Okay, but in what way? Right? And then they're going to say, well, by way of processions. Okay, but the processions, you know, you read James Dozel and others, you know, they're trying to, there's the way that they understand the processions ends up collapsing the persons. In my view, it seems like they're collapsing the persons. That the begotten, you know, the processions itself seems to be numerically identical to the Father, right? And if it's numerically identical to the Father, well, then you end up having the three persons collapse. So again, I don't see how divine simplicity and the doctrine of the Trinity can be coherent from a Thomist perspective, and then they'll appeal to relative identity. And relative identity, it may help in terms of linguistic distinctions with sortals and stuff, but it doesn't allow you to make metaphysical distinctions, which is really what we're trying to focus on, right? How do you have metaphysical distinctions? You have these three modifications of the divine substance, and the modes really seem to be treated as properties or parts. That's what it seems to be treated as. When you read some of the literature, and I'm thinking specifically of Matthew Badendorf's paper, modes can be conceived of as properties or parts, right? And so we need to, you know, we need more clarity on these distinctions and how they fit with each other. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but I'm sympathetic with Dr. Stephen Nemesh's criticisms of Thomism and the Thomistic conception of the Trinity. Now, how do I think we can move forward from the Thomist conception of the Trinity? Well, I think that William Hasker and Chad McIntosh, I think that's going to be the way forward for Trinitarians. And I think that some of the work that it's coming from Joshua Sijiwadi and some other scholars are going to be helpful to see different metaphysical systems that can be used for the Trinity. I was thinking, like, if truthmaker theory, right? If you apply truthmaker theory to the Trinity, it's like the Father is he's the truth maker, and the Son is the truth bearer, and then the Son and the Father are the truth maker, and the Holy Spirit is the truth bearer. So if you use truthmaker theory, because I know Jeffrey Brower uses it for divine simplicity, I mean, you still have the distinction where the Father is the one that is, it seems like you already have a property distinction between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, intrinsic. And you could think of Keith Yandel's paper about, property bearers being embedded in God, but these distinctions, it seems intrinsic to, or I should say it this way, that what is, in analyzing the processions, it presupposes a metaphysical distinctions between the three divine persons prior to the processions. Now they're trying to say, well, the processions in and of itself is the basis of these essential defining features of each divine person. But they're saying that there are no real features between the divine persons, but the processions themselves. And that seems incoherent to say that there are no features that are distinct within the divine substance. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to say that, the distinctions are about the persons, but not the essence. And what I'm saying is, well, the persons are grounded in the essence. And so, if there's distinctions in the persons, well, there has to be distinctions in the essence, because the essence is what grounds the persons, right? Yeah. Now, what they could say is, well, no, the persons ground the divine essence, right? And that's, you can make that move too, but either way, seems like what is true, and so what they're going to say is that there is no part-whole relation. And so what's true about the persons is not true about the divine essence, right? And that doesn't make any sense, because the three divine persons, if they're numerically identical to the divine essence, whatever's true about the divine persons is also true about the divine essence. And that's why, this merry-go-round, the logical problem of the Trinity, it applies to Thomism, right? And it doesn't apply necessarily for some of the other systems. Like, for example, in my review of Dr. William Lane Craig and Mohammed Hijab, Dr. Craig's view easily gets out of the logical problem of the Trinity, right? But the Thomist conception, well, there's exactly one God, right? The Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God, right? The Father is not the Son is not the Father, the Holy Spirit is not the Father, the Holy Spirit is not the Son, right? So, and yet the conclusion is there is one God, right? Well, that is, they're going to say that each person is numerically identical to the divine essence, the divine substance, but the divine substance is not numerically identical to each divine person, in the sense that the Son in and of himself is not all of who God is, right? And the Holy Spirit is not, the Father is not all of who God is. The Holy Spirit is not all of who God is, right? So each person, even with perichoresis, you can say that they're mutually entailing or they're coextensive, etc. But fundamentally, each person is not the Trinity, right? The three persons are the Trinity. Each person is, in and of himself, is not the Trinity. And yet, divine simplicity says that the Father is numerically identical to God, and God is numerically identical to the Father. The Son is numerically identical to God, and God is numerically identical to the Son. The Holy Spirit is numerically identical to God, and God is numerically identical to the Holy Spirit. And yet somehow there's one God, right? And the only way that this can be overcome is either affirming some sort of Mysterianism, which I think some Thomists do that, or applying some type of relative identity. But relative identity you look at Michael Ray and Jeffrey Brower, if you read William Hasker's critique of them, their view doesn't have the resources, the metaphysical resources to be able to ground monotheism, right? Without, it seems, the three persons collapsing into one person. And so relative identity, it may be able to, looking at Peter Van den Wagen's paper on relative identity, it can make linguistic distinctions between the three persons, but it cannot make sense of metaphysical distinctions about the three persons with divine simplicity. And so there needs to be something more than what the Thomist is offering us to be able to account for these extra mental distinctions within God, right? And so I think that Stephen Nemesh's arguments against divine simplicity from the Thomist viewpoint, I think that's accurate. So divine simplicity does not work, in my view, for grounding the Trinity, right? It doesn't work. I think we need to appeal to something else beyond divine simplicity. Specifically, I think that we need to follow Garrett Smith, Stephen Dumont, and others articulating Scotus's understanding of simplicity, which by the Thomist accounts isn't really divine simplicity. It's not, right? And if that's your view, is my view, I'm happy to say that I don't believe in divine simplicity. I deny it, or just say I believe in a weaker spectrum of divine simplicity, right? It really depends on who I'm talking to, right? So if you think Scotus's view is divine simplicity, well, then I guess I affirm divine simplicity, but it's very different than Thomas Aquinas's conception. But I think most of the Thomists are going to say that it's not divine simplicity, right? And you can look at Mark K. Spencer's paper, The Flexibility of Divine Simplicity, and you can look at some of the other papers on divine simplicity, right? You can look at, I know there's a new one that I have yet to read, and I confess, I think it's Jared, what's his name? I can look up the paper, it's in my queue. Let's see, I'll have to look it up. Just go on to Phil Papers and type in divine simplicity, and you can see, it's within 2021, 2022, I think it was published. I think it was, forgetting what journal it was. I think it was, I can't remember, but it's in my queue. So, I mean, divine simplicity, I understand the intuition to affirm it, because you want to have the most robust conception of monotheism possible. And that's why Khalil Andani, right, he affirms it as a Shia Ismaili Muslim, but I don't think divine simplicity is coherent, right? So I'm going to have differences with Dr. Andani, and I think that Dr. Stephen Nemes, he would agree with me on critiquing divine simplicity. But as a Trinitarian myself, I think that for a Trinitarian, we don't need divine simplicity to affirm monotheism. And we don't need divine simplicity to affirm divine aseity. Look at my video that I did on divine aseity without simplicity. I think that there are ways to affirm monotheism without divine simplicity. And you can still affirm that God is ultimate, that God is the metaphysical foundation of all reality. You can still affirm that God is ase, right? And the way that you will affirm God is ase is going to be slightly different than the way that classical theists that affirm divine simplicity would articulate it. But you're still going to have divine aseity, right? You're still going to, the paper I talk about in that specific video is a paper by, I think, Sarah Adams and John, forget his name, but it's called Analyzing Aseity. And they make some of the same moves or points that I'm thinking about with the aseity, that there is a way to conceive of divine aseity without divine simplicity, right? So you have to look at those videos that I've made. But yeah, hopefully this is interesting and enlightening. Just some thoughts. And I'm sure all the Thomists are going to say that I completely botched their view. Well, I mean, I try to cite scholars that defend divine simplicity and the Trinity. And I think I mentioned Chris Tweed's paper on the Trinity, where he does try to articulate, he tries to deal with the logical problem of the Trinity, affirming the Trinity and affirming divine simplicity. So that paper you might want to check out. Well, I hope this is interesting and enlightening, and I hope you have a great evening. Peace and God bless. And I see a comment in the chat. What church do I belong to? Not sure that's really relevant to this discussion, but I am a Southern Baptist, like my denomination. So I'm an evangelical. I'm not Roman Catholic. I'm not Eastern Orthodox. I'm not Anglican. I'm not Lutheran. So technically I'm evangelical. And supposedly Baptists in the 17th century are Protestant. We're not Anabaptists. So I guess I can use the Protestant label as well. I'm a Protestant. But my friends that are Presbyterians and Lutherans will say that I'm not Protestant as a Baptist. So, has gifts ceased or continue? Are they continuous? Well, yeah. So that's kind of a red herring or it's more of a red herring than what we're discussing here. But my particular views, I'm not considered a robust view of. I don't affirm a robust view of cessation of the gifts, but I'm not a Pentecostal, so my understanding of the gifts are not going to be. It's not going to be like a Pentecostal, but I do believe that there are gifts, but I'm not a continuationist like most Pentecostals are, right? So I kind of try to keep a balanced view on that. Yeah. So another individual said, surprised to see a Baptist talk about blessed Scotus. Fair enough. I call him blessed, so you can probably guess which church I'm in. Okay. So so there are some Scotus interacting with Thomist still. Jeffrey Goff, I think his name is. I talked about Stephen Dumont, Garrett Smith. Definitely check out Garrett Smith's work on Scotus. Tom Ward, he's written on Scotus, but I mean, Richard Cross is he's the premier scholar on Scotus. Thomas Williams has written a little bit on Scotus with Jeffrey Steele. But yeah, Scotus definitely. I mean, if you want me to go deeper, I probably subscribe to a similar view to Scotus and Thomas on my understanding of soteriology. But yeah, glad you're enjoying the discussion. Definitely find great value in Scotus. And I didn't mention Scotus's work. So the specific work that I've used in my analysis, so obviously using secondary sources, but the primary source is the Ordia or Ordio. That's going to be like the primary source for Scotus that I've used. Yeah. So I hope this was interesting. Yeah. Take a look at my videos if you are interested in how I understand divine simplicity, how I understand the Holy Trinity, how I understand God, right? Yeah. So peace and God bless.